All right, guys, if you go to profootballfocus.com,
PFF.com.
oh, there you go. Yeah. If we go to PFF.com, you can see our 2019 rankings for the top quarterbacks. We have them listed there. But you can also find how we rank the secondaries for every single team in the NFL. And it got me to thinking that we know it's a quarterback-driven league, right? Mm-hmm. And on the defensive side, it's a coverage-driven league. You've got to be able to cover, and you got to have competency at the quarterback level. So I was thinking, is it good for us to maybe talk about what we could expect in 2019 with the top quarterbacks, those of quarterbacks that are playing at the high level, who are playing with top secondaries, and how that might fare?
Yeah, I mean, because we know that if you look at Pro Football Focus grades in terms of what correlates to winning, it's passing above and beyond. How the quarterback does is the number one variable, but then second to that is coverage. How well do you cover? And so if you pair those two things together, you do get sort of like this dynamite effect in terms of being able to win football games at the NFL level. And what you do is the coverage takes pressure off of the quarterback in turn takes pressure off of the coverage, and it is really the sort of way to go here. So when we're looking at trying to handicap who's going to be the best quarterbacks, it's often good to look at, okay, what do they have on the other side of the field, because that's going to be sort of whether or not they're under pressure all the time in terms of coming from behind or facing other teams like best pass rushers for half the game type of thing, versus if he has a great secondary, he might be playing from ahead all the time and really making high percentage efficient throws throughout the game.
That hold true for you, Sam, in terms of what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean it's obviously not a one-to-one exact science. You have quarterbacks like Mahomes last year has one of the best seasons we've ever seen, playing with one of the worst secondaries we've ever seen. But I think there's a clear trend that a lot of these top quarterbacks have got really good secondaries helping them out and making their life easier. It doesn't necessarily determine whether you're going to be good or not, but it certainly makes things easier for you to succeed.
Steve, I know you want to talk about Tom Brady because he's number one on our list, and rightfully so. But there are secondary ranks higher than maybe what most people think. You don't see the individual stars, but collectively, that secondary is ranked fifth on our list.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the last three Patriots Super Bowl wins, the Patriots ranked as a top three coverage team in our grades from 2014, 16, and then last year, 2018, Stephon Gilmore was our highest graded corner. So Brady's always going to, put up top five type of quarterback ability. And then, having, that coverage ability has been, pretty much the difference every time they make a playoff run. Whereas, 2017, when they lost to the Philadelphia Eagles, they had a disastrous secondary. Even though they showed signs of life, they gave up a ton of points, against the Eagles. But last year, you could see that complementary piece when the pass game's working or not working, and then coverage.
When you have to be, and that in the 2017 Patriots shows how careful you have to be with these things, right? Because in 2018, the Patriots covered extremely well, right? Yeah. And in 2017, they were a little shaky there. And especially the first 3-4 games, they were awful.
Right. And then they got better, right?
They got better, but their schedule is a lot easier because they're facing the the AFC East, and so coverage is one of those things that's almost as important as passing, but passing is 10 times more predictable in some sense than coverage. So when we say this team has a good secondary, we're sort of saying, given that they'll play like they did last year, given that there's not cluster injuries, because for a quarterback, obviously losing somebody like Gronk is big for Brady, but he's overcome that before. Mm-hmm. But the Patriots secondary losing two players would completely, jettison their effort to be a top secondary again. So it's just what's more stable as well as what's more, what helps us predict things.
Sam, what can we expect from the LA Rams when, I should say LA Chargers, I'm sorry, the Chargers, when you look at what Phillip Rivers is doing, he ranks really high among the quarterbacks on our list, but his secondary, fourth best in the NFL, and one might argue that that secondary is one of the best in the NFL.
Yeah, I think you've got some really interesting players in that secondary. You've got Casey Hayward, who's had phenomenal PFF grades basically since the outset. His rookie season where he was playing in the slot was one of the best statistical and graded seasons we've ever seen. It's just that it didn't really get the notice because he was their third cornerback playing inside. It doesn't get the notice of the guys playing on the outside. Then you've got Derwin James comes in last season, is one of the most dynamic, versatile playmakers in the NFL, in the entire league. They have drafted additions, rookies that are going to come in and potentially make that even more scary. The only real question mark is whether they can get a a good play out of the number 2 corner, but they're strong in a bunch of areas to make that secondary a really formidable unit.
Well, we've seen it acutely with Phillip Rivers, right? Because he's had, great seasons followed by poor seasons followed by great seasons, and oftentimes it is the circumstances he's in. When he's with the Chargers last season, they're ahead a lot. He's not under a lot of pressure, even though that offensive line isn't great. He's not under a lot of game level pressure of playing from behind and all that, and we get an efficient, solid performance from him. You look back to 2015, 2016, that team's sort of behind all the time. They're forcing him, and he's sort of more of a gunslinger, so he's going to put more balls in the hands of the defenders sometimes. And again, it's just sort of one of those things where he's still the same player, but circumstances have such a context has such an influence on how they end up playing, and it's only the real outliers like Mahomes last year that can overcome having to put up 30 points a game consistently that end up doing so.
How about Baker Mayfield, though? I mean, here's the quarterback that we're expecting a lot from him in 2019. He's got all the weapons around him on offense, but he has a secondary that ranks in our top 10. So is that part of maybe the story that we're not focusing on enough? The fact that Baker Mayfield is going to have a really good defense and a good secondary to play with on Sundays.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think that's why, part of the reason why people are high on the Cleveland Browns, not just because of Baker, not just because OBJ comes over and now they've got this really nice group of weapons, but because the defense has added a lot on the defensive line, and then in the secondary, Denzel Ward looked fantastic last year. We talk about him being the 4th overall pick and feel like the Browns made the right move there, not going with Bradley Chubb, not going with other players, going with a guy who's probably the top corner in that draft class right now, and then adding Greedy Williams, who was our top man coverage corner last year, who fell to the 2nd round. We'll see, why he fell. There's some off-field concerns about him and all that, but if he lives up to the way he played in college, that secondary is much improved.
Well, can we talk for a second about the other direction? Is it what a good quarterback does for a secondary, right? Because when you're a team that's ahead, right, and I always think about those old Packer teams that didn't have great defenses, and when Rodgers would get hurt, they would be exposed. But when you have a great quarterback in the stable, you know that you can be more aggressive. You know that you can try to get more turnovers, because if they score on you, your quarterback's going to come back and have a better than average chance of scoring to even the score again, right? And so what I think is interesting about this conversation is it goes both ways. Baker Mayfield being a good young quarterback is going to help us see the goodness of that Browns defense better than when they had DeShone Kizer in there, even though they still had some talent on that defensive side of the ball. We didn't see it because they were always under siege.
Right. And it's the flip side of the argument that, a bad secondary puts your quarterback in disadvantageous positions. It forces him to have to throw to keep up with the scores you're just giving up. It's the exact opposite, right? If you've got a quarterback that's putting up points for you, suddenly now you're putting the opposing quarterback in bad spots. They're throwing the ball where they wouldn't necessarily want to. So your secondary has got some better opportunities to make plays and look better than they might be.
Well, we saw that with the Minnesota Vikings, for example, right, where they've had one of the best defenses in the league. The Bears were also pretty good on defense prior to last season, but you almost don't see the fruits of that necessarily until you get good quarterback play or good offensive play, because those defenses can now pin their ears back and make plays because they're not so worried about giving up the 17th point in a game when your offense isn't going to get that far. You're fine with that, and you can sort of trade those high leverage plays, those turnovers and those sacks for the riskiness that is associated with being more aggressive.
But wait, there's extreme examples too. Look at the Chiefs last year.
Yeah.
The Chiefs had one of the worst secondaries, and of course, the most valuable quarterback, the MVP of the league, in Patrick Mahomes. There are extremes where the secondary
you can
gets too
overcome
rough.
it, particularly if you coach the way that Andy Reid does. Yeah. Remember, he's on the aggressive. He knows that I got to get a lead because my secondary is going to give up points. My defense is going to give it up. And remember, they led the league in sacks.
Exactly,
so it didn't even equate to the back end of the defense. So they played a different style. They wanted to play from ahead. They knew they had to play with a lead. And remember, they're one D4 neutral zone infraction away from having a 3rd interception against Tom Brady and maybe winning the AFC title.
Well, Solomon brings up that point. I think the Chiefs overperformed what you would expect from their talent level last year.
Right.
In many reasons, because they were in such good game scripts, they could get more sacks, they could get more takeaways than probably they should have, given their sort of lack of talent at linebacker and in the secondary. So even though they were bad, they were less bad than I think we could have ever seen. Alex Smith is a QB, for example.
I have one on how a secondary can clearly keep you in the game despite maybe the quarterback even struggling. How about the Super Bowl with Jared Goff? Jared Goff maybe struggled a little bit in the game. The run game wasn't working, but their defense was able to keep the score down, kept that game close. The Rams was always in it right up until the very end. Maybe that's a good example of what we're talking about when you have quarterback play that's maybe at least even, and the secondary on the defense is really able to keep the score down. You can win a lot of games. You may have to steal a few by getting those turnovers or keeping the score down. But the secondary can keep you in it, even in a big game like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Jared Goff, he's probably not a top 10 caliber quarterback as far as what his production will be, but he has top 10 output potential in that offense with really good playmakers, the play action game, and all that stuff. So you can get top 10 output from your passing game, and then you pair that with Aqib Talib in the secondary. They were a much different defense when Talib was on the field last year. He's fantastic on one side. Marcus Peters didn't even play that well last year, but in any given year, he has that turnover potential. You know, he'll give up a lot, but he's still, you know, he knows how to make plays on the ball. But they add Eric Weddle, Johnson back there at strong safety too. So they're really deep in the secondary. And from a team building standpoint, I think they've done a fantastic job of getting some quality veterans in there and then starting to build with some youth like Troy Hill.
Well, they valued a position that was becoming increasingly valuable in Nickel Roby-Coleman. When he came in, they said, "Oh, we already have a slot in LaMarcus Joyner," and they're like, "No, it's probably good to have a cornerback, kind of like you, go back and play safety, right? And he's going to be a better coverage player as a result." And now you have a secondary full of guys who have man coverage ability and also position versatility. It was a very smart move for them.
And Wade Phillips.
And when Joyner leaves, it's not the biggest thing in the world because they've done a good job of drafting and
Russell
developing.
Wilson keep it up? Because this is a secondary. Earl Thomas is gone. The Legion of Boom is gone. In fact, that secondary entering 2019 on our list on PFF.com, we have the Seahawks listed or ranked 31st in terms of their secondary. Russell Wilson's got to carry a bad secondary, and man, they may have to play from behind on the scoreboard a little bit.
Well, the risky thing with Seattle is they need to flip their own game script. They have we always talk about, you need to find a top 10 quarterback. Well, they have a top 5 to 8 quarterback every single year in Russell Wilson, and they're still trying to run this old school, protect the ball, run game.
Run first
offense, and it's really difficult to do when you have that kind of secondary because, Eric, what's the best way to protect your defense? Is it running the ball and keeping the ball away from the opposing
No, it's to get a lead.
It's just to score points.
It's to get a lead. Yeah.
And the best way to score points is with the pass game. So I think it's a weird dynamic in Seattle because 2 years ago they put more on Russell Wilson's plate. They had 0 running game and they didn't make the playoffs. And they felt like, hey, we didn't make the playoffs because we had no run game. Last year, completely flipped the scripts. They had a huge run game, run scripts. They were as run heavy as any team in the NFL, not named the Ravens. And they won one more game. And, so I don't think they should be afraid of putting the ball in Russell Wilson's hands, especially with that.
The difficulty with win is that, when you went into last season, I think their win total was 7.5. People were not happy with them. But you look and said, okay, but they have star-level talent on very important positions on the roster. You had Doug Baldwin, you had Bobby Wagner, you had Earl Thomas, you had Frank Clark, and you had Russell Wilson, right? You lose Frank Clark, you lose Doug Baldwin, you lose Earl Thomas. Right now, the Seahawks are in danger of becoming a quarterback without a team, aside from Bobby Wagner. And that's the difficult part. They got, they drafted so well from, 2011, 2010, up until maybe 2014, 2015, and now it's sort of like you look and say, okay, how much can Russell Wilson carry this team? And I think to your point, it's important for them to at least figure it out because they're probably not going to with the running game.
If this secondary doesn't hold up, they're going to be playing from behind, which means they can't lean on the league's #1 ranked rushing attack.
And the big problem is they're still playing as if the defense, as if everything is still intact. Like nothing has changed game plan wise. So you've got the quarterback that could potentially, a bit like Aaron Rodgers has done in the past, Andrew Luck has done in the past. Quarterbacks, really good quarterbacks can make up for a lot of deficiencies if you take the approach of it's all on them. Put it on their shoulders, let them do it. The Seahawks don't do that with Wilson. They still want him to function as part of this run-heavy offense, which will put the defense in positions of needing to make stops. And now, none of the Legion of Boom is there. They're all gone. Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, Brandon Brown. There's nobody left. It's a bunch of young guys that have come in, none of whom have really stepped into the shoes of the guys they've replaced. The only guy left is Bobby Wagner, and he's trying to on his own keep the defense at the same kind of level because the offense is not cutting loose and putting points up.
You know what I think is a real good comparison, though, real quick? Early career Tom Brady, early career Ben Roethlisberger, and then early career Russell Wilson. They were all in situations where they won championships where the defense was a huge part of it.
Absolutely.
And, so Brady as a, first-year starter was pretty good, but it certainly
kind of
wasn't.
managed the offense,
But
right?
he was game manager mode.
That's
Ben
right.
Roethlisberger had one of the worst winning Super Bowl performances of all time in his second year in 2005.
He was a manager, yeah.
Right? But you saw something in all of those guys, right? And they would make a few plays here and there. And Russell Wilson was similar. Russell Wilson's been good since his rookie season. And just the fact that the defense was elite at that time doesn't take away from what he's capable of.
Right.
But what happened with Brady and what happened with Roethlisberger is there was a point where the team said, okay, it's your team, go get him, right? The defense isn't as good as it was before, whatever it is. And they've been competitive every single year. I feel like that's the type of move Seattle has to make.
Yeah, that
give him
needs to
5 to
happen.
10 more passing attempts and forget the game manager stuff because Russell Wilson can carry a team.
Well, let's finish up by talking about Big Ben in 2019 because he ranks 8th on our quarterback list, but his secondary ranks 28th. Last year, this is a secondary that only had 8 interceptions in a 16-game season. One might argue is one of the reasons why they missed the playoffs last year. Could the Steelers be out of the playoffs again in 2019 because of this imbalance? We know Big Ben is going to play at a high level, but the secondary doesn't have appeared to have gotten any better.
Well, it's interesting because Big Ben didn't grade that well for us, right? He was like in 16th in terms of grade, even though we have him sort of more because of his prior information at 8th. But he did not play well, in terms of accuracy. He did not play well in terms of, making turnover-worthy plays and
Missed
things like that.
a ton of throws last
Missed
year.
a ton of
And
throws
they
last
threw
year.
the ball more than any other
Yep.
team last year.
And I think that's like sort of what saved them because when you throw a lot, you just get the benefits of how much more effective.
ratios, yeah.
Yeah, and so you lose Antonio Brown, which I think was probably an okay move for them because he's going in the wrong direction. But you really do need the Moncriefs, the Washingtons of the world, the Juju Smith-Schuster to emerge even more than he did a season ago, the Vance McDonalds to emerge because that is going to be a rough, go of it for their secondary. I will say though, last season, a lot of their losses were by like a field goal, right? So you're talking about they started 7-2-1, and then the last 4 games they lost were all by like a score or less. And so you flip a couple of those, right? Then you end up with you squeak into the playoffs maybe at 10-6 or 11-5, and we were viewing them differently today. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think you get a little bit of improvement from Big Ben from where he was last year. I think that helps the secondary quite a bit this season.
Their schedule was rough last year, too. They had that good start, but down the stretch, they finally beat the New England Patriots, and then they have to play the Saints in New Orleans the next week. I mean, it was a really tough schedule down the stretch. I feel like that defense epitomizes the findings you have come up with recently, where it's like, all right, defensive rankings are so dependent on who you play. In the offense, the Steelers, we've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast, right? There's always a point during the season where the Steelers' defense looks pretty good, and then you look back and it's like, well, they just played Blaine Gabbert, and they just played Tom Savage, and they just played these other guys. But when they go up against usually Brady, usually Phillip Rivers, Drew Brees, when they go up against the best offenses, they've got no shot. So I feel like that defense has a bit of an identity crisis where they like to play zone, but they have to play man against the better teams, and they just don't have the pieces to really compete against good passing offenses.
That's the thing. Is that it's schematically it's in a good place, right? The coaching is smart. They're able to put the players in a reasonable position to succeed. But at some point, the lack of talent gets found out, and it's when you go up against those best offenses.
Good point.
And it's the lack of talent in the wrong places, right? So
Yeah.
they're very good on the interior of the defensive line, but we know that that's not necessarily as effective as getting pressure off the edge. They've failed in drafting in that position for a while. TJ Watt might be good, but he's still somebody that they need to emerge and be a superstar. And then at linebacker, they've really struggled since Shazier got injured. And then at corner, Artie Burns, is a player that they bought into as their outside corner, and he's now being replaced by Steven Nelson.
But what does
of
it
the
say
Chiefs.
about their secondary that Joe Hayden gets released and they bring him in off
he's
the
starting
street,
right
and
away.
he's their best corner.
Yeah.
He clearly is their best cover guy on the back end.
Well, they could piece it together this year. Hayden, if he continues to play okay, I know he struggled at the end with the Browns. Steven Nelson he has 2 of his last 3 years with the Chiefs were pretty good.
That's right.
And then Mike Hilton's a nickel guy that I think we like a lot, and he does a lot of great things in terms of blitzing. He covers in the slot really well. So they do have a chance to have some competency back
The
there.
corners could be solid. The safety is still a pretty significant concern. You've got Terrell Edmonds, the 6th rounder taken in the 1st round, who, he needs to do some work to get just being average. And then you've got Sean Davis, who remains a big
An
play
enigma,
disaster waiting to happen. So that would be the big concern, is that no matter what they do, and they're in a really good spot in terms of scheme, there's just big plays all over this defense waiting to happen from somebody screwing up, and that's their issue.
There's a lot of pressure on Devin Bush, their first-round pick, too, to be that coverage linebacker immediately. You know, that was one of those picks in the draft where it's like, here's a major need. We're gonna trade up 10 spots and try to fill it.
Well, and he probably was overdrafted by about 10 spots, so he's going to have more pressure on him than probably is warranted, because the Steelers decided this is our guy, and they took basically him with 2 picks, right, and moved up to get him. And that's going to be something where you wonder, between him and White was probably the more quality player at that position. Hopefully Bush can live up to at least like reasonable expectations there, because they've really missed that position.
Even Shazier, he was becoming pretty good before that unfortunate injury, but he took a few years to turn from an athlete into a quality coverage player.
See, this is really cool stuff. See, many of our fans for PFF.com, they can go to the website, they can take a look at the list of our quarterbacks and how we have them ranked for 2019, compare it to how we've ranked the secondaries around the National Football League, and see what they can come up with.